Julián wasn't a man who believed in signs. He had spent more than 3 decades traveling the same routes between Hermosillo and Guadalajara, with his old trailer, his coffee thermos, and a radio that only worked when he wanted it to. He was 52 years old and had few certainties in life, but one of them was that no one stops for anyone on a deserted highway. He lived alone, without a wife or children, in a small apartment with peeling walls and a fan that barely relieved the desert heat. He often slept with his boots on, ate what he found at gas stations, and spoke little. His world was asphalt and memories, especially one, Elena, the woman who had once loved him and who disappeared when he decided his life should go on. Since then, routine was his shield. Load, drive, deliver, sleep. He never looked at the side of the road, until that day. It was almost 6 in the evening when he saw the figure. At kilometer 218, on a forgotten stretch of highway heading to Tepic, next to a rusty sign that barely read "Detour," stood a teenage girl alone. She didn't make any signs. She didn't cry aloud, but her eyes, swollen, red, empty, spoke without words. Julián drove on, or tried to. Something in his chest, something he didn't know was still working, forced him to brake a few meters ahead. He got out of the truck without thinking, as if his legs were moving on their own, and walked toward her. Mariana was 18, and at that moment, she seemed more like a child than a woman. She didn't say, "Hello," or "Help." She looked him straight in the eyes and said in a dry, trembling voice, "They told me to wait for you." Julián didn't respond immediately. The phrase disconcerted him, not because of its content, but because of the certainty with which it was said. He looked at her carefully. Her face was dirty, her lips chapped by the sun, and a torn backpack lay at her feet. Without asking questions, he took off his cap, offered it to her, and pointed at the truck. Mariana hesitated for a moment, as if still waiting for a trick, a trap, something. But then she nodded slowly and walked behind him. She climbed into the trailer without another word, sat down silently, hugging the backpack tightly. Julián started the engine with no clear direction, unsure of where he should take her. He only knew he couldn't leave her there. That day, for the first time in years, he didn't think about the delivery time or the weight of the load. He thought about what it meant to have someone by his side. If any of this touched you, subscribe. We need your support to keep telling stories worth telling. For the first few kilometers, no one spoke. Julián offered her water and some crackers from his box of supplies. Mariana ate in silence, like someone who hadn't eaten in days. Then she leaned against the window, and although she kept her eyes open, she seemed far away, very far away. Julián didn't insist. He had learned, over so many years behind the wheel, that some pains aren't revealed with questions, but with time and space. He turned on the radio softly to break the silence without invading it. An old José Alfredo song filled the cabin. Mariana hummed it softly, and Julián realized that something, however small, had broken. The wall between them was no longer concrete. It was dust, fragile, the kind of wall that crumbles with patience and presence. Night caught up with them in a town called Santa Lucia del Camino. Julián knew the stop well, a simple restaurant next to a gas station where truckers used to sleep in their vehicles. He bought 2 plates of hot food, one for himself and one for Mariana. She hesitated before accepting, but finally sat down at the small wooden table, lowered her gaze, and ate slowly. Julián watched her not with pity, but with a different kind of respect. He didn't know what had happened to her, but he understood that whatever it was, it had been big. When they finished, he offered her the chance to sleep in the truck's bunk, while he settled into the passenger seat. Mariana nodded. That night, Julián didn't sleep at all. He listened to every little movement, attentive as if guarding a fragile treasure that the world must never damage again. The next morning, Mariana was the first to wake up. When Julián opened his eyes, she was already sitting on the edge of the bunk, combing her hair with her fingers. "Thanks for not asking any questions," she said softly. Julián just nodded and started the engine. At that moment, he decided he wasn't going to hand her over to any police station or social assistance office. He knew a shelter in San Pedro Lagunitas, run by a woman he had helped years before with repairs there. It wasn't luxurious, but it offered safety, food, and above all, dignity. He took the detour without saying anything to Mariana. If she asked, he'd explain, but if she didn't ask, he'd keep driving. Because for the first time in a long time, he felt like his steering wheel had another weight, that of a decision not on the GPS. During the drive, the weather changed. A soft drizzle began to fall on the windshield, and Julián slowed down. Mariana, still silent, began to observe the landscape more closely. She didn't ask where they were going, but her eyes were no longer lost. Julián noticed how her hands, once clenched, now rested on his legs. Around a bend, he began to talk. He told her about a dog he once rescued in Sinaloa, and how it had been with him for 3 years until it died in its sleep one cold morning. Mariana listened without interrupting, and finally uttered a simple phrase. "I had one too." It was the first real bridge between them, a shared memory. From then on, the words began to flow little by little, like drops that dare to break the roof of an abandoned house. Upon arriving in San Pedro Lagunitas, the sky was clear. Julián parked the truck in front of the rusty iron gate marked Kilometer Zero. Mariana looked at him, waiting for instructions. "This is it," he said. They got out together. A dark-haired woman in her 60s came out to greet them. "Another one?" she asked sweetly, as if she already knew everything without needing details. Julián nodded and explained that Mariana needed a place to breathe, even if it was for a few days. The woman, whose name was Dora, hugged the young woman without asking questions. Julián stayed in the truck, watching from afar. He didn't feel his role ended there, but he didn't know what it still was either. The only thing he knew for sure was that he couldn't continue as before. Something in him had changed, even if he couldn't name it yet. These stories don't write themselves. If you want us to continue, subscribe to the channel. That makes all the difference. Dora offered Mariana a room, small but clean, with a wooden bed, a thick blanket, and a shelf of old books. Mariana didn't ask how long she could stay. She just walked in, set her backpack aside, and sat on the edge of the mattress, like someone who hasn't yet allowed herself to fully trust anyone. Julián said goodbye that afternoon, saying he would return in a few days to check on her. He didn't promise anything, but he didn't leave indifferently either. On the way back, she felt something strange in her chest, a kind of relief mixed with sadness, as if she had finally let go of a burden she didn't know she was carrying. That night, she slept better than she had in years. She didn't dream of Elena or of endless journeys. She dreamed of a tree in the middle of the desert, and someone, a little girl, sitting in its shade. 3 days passed before Julián returned. He brought a few things with him: toilet paper, cookies, a couple of books he'd bought at a second-hand store. When he arrived, Mariana was no longer in the room. She was out in the backyard, helping paint a mural with some other girls. Julián watched her for a while from a distance. Her face was smeared with paint, but her eyes shone with a light he'd never seen before. Mariana waved at him, shy but sincere. In that gesture, Julián felt it had all been worth it. He spent the rest of the day helping with minor repairs: a door that wouldn't lock, a leaky faucet, a lamp without a bulb. No one asked him for anything, but everyone knew they could count on him, as if his presence were a silent promise that at least there, things wouldn't break again. Mariana began to talk more to Dora, sometimes in a low voice, other times with long pauses, but with an obvious need to get out everything she'd been bottling up. She'd been raised by her mother and a violent stepfather. She had run away more than once. The last time, her mother told her she was too old and would have to fend for herself. Mariana went through strangers' homes, nights on the streets, and promises of help that turned out to be nothing more than traps. Until one day a woman told her at a bus station, "Wait for the truck driver in the grey cap. He'll know what to do." Julián unwittingly had been singled out as if he were part of a plan no one had written down, but everyone understood. Dora listened without interrupting. She knew that sometimes words were knives and other times bandages. Julián began to come more often. Every 2 or 3 days he would stop by the shelter and always bring something: sweet bread, tools, repair materials, or simply his time. He never asked too many questions. Sometimes he would sit in the courtyard with Mariana, and she would read aloud from the books he brought her. Other times they would simply share the silence, as if they'd learned that you don't have to fill every space to be together. One day Mariana asked him about Elena. Julián lowered his gaze and said she had been the great love of his life, but he'd lost her because he didn't know how to stay. "Now you're staying," she said with a faint smile. And Julián understood that, for the first time, he wasn't the one leaving. He was the one arriving. Did you stop here? Then you're part of this. Subscribe so we can continue sharing what others prefer to keep quiet. Over time, the shelter began to transform. Where once there had been peeling walls, there were now colorful murals. Where silence had once reigned, laughter, voices, and even music now rang out. Julián, without intending to, became part of the place. He planted trees, taught people how to change tires, and repaired stoves. The girls regarded him with respect, some with suspicion at first, but little by little with trust. He never crossed a line. He never raised his voice. He was like a discreet beacon in the midst of chaos, shining without dazzling. Mariana became his main companion. She shared her ideas, her plans, her doubts. And Julián listened to everything with the patience of someone who knows that there aren't always answers, but that simply being there means something. One night during a thunderstorm, the power went out throughout the village. The girls were frightened. Some relived traumas, others couldn't sleep. Julián got off his mattress and lit candles throughout the shelter. Then he made cinnamon tea and went room by room, leaving a warm cup at each door. Mariana helped him silently. In the end, the two of them stayed in the kitchen, watching the candles tremble in the wind. "Do you get scared sometimes too?" she asked. Julián nodded. "But less so this time," he said, watching one candle linger. That night, they didn't speak again, but something was sealed between them, a nameless alliance, forged with small but indelible acts. Julián wasn't their savior. He was their witness, and sometimes that was all it took to keep from breaking. After a few months, Mariana began to write. At first, they were loose sentences in a recycled notebook. Then, longer texts, stories that spoke of invisible girls, of women escaping from the night, of hands unconditionally extended. Dora encouraged her to continue. Julián, without much understanding of letters, celebrated each page as if it were a victory. One afternoon, Mariana read aloud a text titled "The House That Doesn't Judge." When she finished, several girls applauded silently. Julián, with moist eyes, said to her, "You have something I never had, a way of expressing what hurts without hurting others." Mariana treasured that sentence. From then on, writing became her way of breathing. Each word was a way of letting go of what she no longer wanted to carry. The shelter began to receive more people. Girls arrived from other cities, some recommended, others brought by social workers or women who had been there. Clara, 16, with a baby in her arms. Erica, 20, escaping a trafficking ring. Tomás, a young trans man rejected by his family. They all arrived with broken eyes, and they all found something resembling a place to start over. Julián didn't ask. He simply observed, helped, and was there. When a door needed a new hinge, he was there. When a bicycle broke, he fixed it. Mariana jokingly nicknamed him the man who mends the world. And although he laughed every time she heard him say it, deep down he felt that finally this was his true profession, mending what others had broken. One day, a local journalist arrived at the shelter. She had heard rumors about a place in San Pedro Lagunillas where wounds were treated without a scalpel. She wanted to interview Mariana, who was hesitant at first, but eventually agreed. She spoke slowly, choosing her words carefully. She didn't share gruesome details. She didn't mention names. She spoke of dignity, of listening, of sharing bread. The article was published under the title, "The Kilometer Where Life Begins." It went viral on local media. Several people donated food, books, and clothing. But curious and opportunistic people also arrived. Dora firmly closed the doors to what smelled like a spectacle. Julián reinforced the gate's bars and built a bench at the entrance. Whoever arrived had to sit, wait, and understand that they weren't there to save anyone, but to learn how to be. Mariana began receiving messages from young women who read her texts and felt that, for the first time, someone had said what they didn't know how to express. One girl wrote, "After reading you, I felt the courage to report." Another, "Thanks to your words, I left that house where they suppressed me." Julián didn't fully understand the impact of those words, but he felt it every time he saw Mariana in front of her notebook, focused, as if weaving an invisible web, with ink that sustained many others. One night, while they were sharing bread and chocolate in the kitchen, Mariana said to him, "Did you know that when I arrived I didn't want to continue?" Julián remained silent. She added, "That day, you didn't speak to me. You just gave me water and opened the door, and that was enough for me to stay." Julián didn't respond. He just reached out and handed her another slice of bread, as if repeating with that gesture, "I'm still here." A year passed. Julián still made trips from time to time, but it was no longer his priority. His house had become a small extension of the shelter. He had tools everywhere, a notebook where he wrote down things he needed to repair, and a glass jar where he kept loose bills for Kilometer Zero emergencies, as he called them. Mariana published her first handmade book with the help of an independent publisher. She called it "The Ones That Didn't Make the News." She presented it at a library in Tepic. Julián went, dressed in his clean plaid shirt and pants without grease stains. He sat in the back row, silent, and listened to her speak in a firm, confident voice. When she finished, he approached her and handed her a wildflower wrapped in a napkin. Mariana accepted it with shining eyes. They didn't need words. They both knew what it all meant. One day, Julián didn't show up. Mariana waited, as always, for the truck to round the bend at the entrance. But nothing. Hours passed, then a whole day. On the second day, she went to his apartment. The door was closed, but the landlord opened it. Julián was lying down, his face serene. He had died asleep, holding the diary. On the nightstand, there was a note that read, "I didn't do much, but I was there." Mariana wept silently. She picked up the diary, full of clumsy but sincere notes. Girls' names, dates, pending repairs, lists of materials. On the last page, a simple drawing, a tree with long roots and a painstakingly written sentence. Where something blossomed that I didn't know I was sowing. The funeral was simple. Dora planted a tree at the entrance to the shelter. Mariana stuck a stone at its feet and wrote, "Here rest the feet of one who chose to stop for love." Julián's absence was a silent blow to everyone at Kilometro Zero. For weeks, every hammer blow, every squeaky chair, or every dripping faucet recalled his name. But Mariana, far from stopping, decided the best thing she could do for him was to continue. She organized a writing workshop for the new girls, using the books he had so thoughtfully brought her. Each week, they sat in a circle and wrote. Some talked about fear, others about escape, many about hope. At the end of each session, Mariana left an empty chair with a tool on it. A screwdriver, a wrench, a flashlight. It was her way of saying that Julián was still there, still mending the world through them. The tree planted in her honor grew quickly. The girls watered it every morning like a ritual. Mariana wrote letters and buried them beneath its roots. Some girls hung ribbons on its branches as silent thanks. And over time, that tree became a symbol of something greater, of the pause that transforms, of the gesture that expects no reward, of the act of stopping for another regardless of one's own destiny. People from other states began to visit the place. Some came seeking refuge, others inspiration. Dora and Mariana made sure that the shelter didn't become a spectacle. "You come here to heal, not to look," Dora repeated, and everyone understood, because Kilometro Cero wasn't just a physical place, it was a decision, a point on the journey where you chose to start differently. Mariana was invited to give talks at schools, community centers, and women's gatherings. At first, she felt uncomfortable, as if her voice didn't belong on those microphones or those stages. But it was enough to see a glance in the audience, a girl with wide eyes, a mother holding back tears to remind her why she was there. She didn't speak of Julián as a hero. She named him as someone who knew how to remain without invading, as a man who never said, "I saved you," but rather, "I stayed." Those words, repeated in different audiences, began to change perceptions. In every city she visited, someone approached to tell their own story, and Mariana listened as she learned from him, without haste, without judgment. Years later, with the support of a network of women and anonymous donations, the first shelter inspired by Kilometro Cero was born, but outside of Nayarit. They called it Raíz Abierta, open route, and it was located in an old abandoned mansion on the outskirts of Guanajuato. Mariana traveled there to attend the opening. She brought a small stone engraved with the initials JR, which she discreetly placed at the foot of a newly planted bougainvillea. "It's so we don't forget that the deepest roots sometimes come from the simplest steps," she said. The phrase was posted on a board near the entrance, and without anyone planning it, each new shelter that sprang up since then included some object, some word, some corner that remembered him. Julián never imagined he would become a symbol, but he did. Not because of grand speeches, but because of everyday actions that left their mark. Clara, the young mother who arrived at the shelter with a baby in her arms, grew up in that caring environment. Her son, Emiliano, took his first steps in the courtyard where Julián had planted a lemon tree. Years later, Clara became a nurse and decided to return to Kilometro Cero as a volunteer. She said she should give back. On one of her visits, she found the old bench Julián had built and restored it with his own hands. He carved into one of the sides, "Here I sat for the first time without fear." That bench became a resting place for those who arrived for the first time, trembling, unsure whether to trust or flee. It was like a symbolic boundary between what hurt and what was about to heal. Meanwhile, Mariana continued writing. Her second book, titled Letters to the One I Didn't Know Was Watching Over Me, was dedicated entirely to Julián. Each chapter was an everyday scene told with tenderness. The time he fixed her broken zipper without asking questions. The day he waited an hour in the rain just to give her a new notebook. The moment they shared a loaf of bread without speaking. The book was published in several countries and translated into 3 languages, but she insisted on presenting it first in community libraries and support centers. She said those were the places where words made a real difference. At each presentation, she placed a small flashlight on the table. "For those who shine without being noticed," she explained, and each time the audience understood without further ado. One day at a secondary school in Oaxaca, a student asked to speak after Mariana gave her a talk. Her name was Luz. She was 15 years old, and her voice was trembling. "I want to be like Julián," she said. There was a profound silence in the auditorium, the kind that speaks louder than any applause. Mariana approached her, took her hand and replied, "So you've started, because you mentioned him with respect." That moment was captured on video and shared thousands of times on social media, not as a viral act, but as a human gesture. Because in a world where many sought to stand out through the noise, there was something profoundly revolutionary in wanting to be like someone who only knew how to be there. That was the seed of a new program that was born months later, Schools That Listen. Inspired by Kilometro Cero, it brought together students to share experiences, listen and accompany. Dora, now older, began to delegate more responsibilities. Mariana took over the general coordination of the shelter, although she continued to write in the early mornings, when the silence gave her space. Sometimes she sat next to Julián's tree with a blanket over her shoulders and a notebook in her lap. She didn't always write new words. Sometimes she reread what she'd already written, as if searching for his voice in those lines, his way of seeing the world. One night, she found a hidden note among the roots. It was from Clara. It said, "Thank you for not having walked on. Thank you for having stopped that day." Mariana read it several times before putting it away, and she understood that this was the real story. Not one of heroes or martyrs, but one of those who, seeing the pain of another, simply decide not to walk on. Over the years, Kilometro Quero adapted to new realities. They opened a trades workshop where carpentry, sewing, and basic electricity were taught. Mariana wanted it to bear Julián's name, but she didn't call it the Julián Rojas Center or the JR Foundation. She called it the Workshop of Silence. At the entrance, a simple plaque read, "Here we fix what others have broken, slowly and with respect." It was a favorite space for many girls. Some came just to drink mate or listen to music. Others learned to repair things and discovered they were capable, useful, and brave. Mariana would often repeat a phrase of Dora's, "Dignity comes through the hands, not through speeches." And that was what was experienced there, without needing to look back to heal, but also without denying what had happened. Julián, although absent, continued to teach with every tool used, with every object repaired. One winter afternoon, Mariana received a handwritten letter. It came with no return address, but in careful handwriting. It read, "I was one of those who saw him stop that day. I haven't forgotten. Since then, I try to stop for others too. Thank you for reminding us that there is still room for kindness." Mariana closed her eyes and allowed herself to cry. Not out of sadness, but of recognition, because she understood that the story they had lived no longer belonged only to them. It was a flame that others took to light their own paths. That night she wrote a new entry in her diary. "If everyone stopped their march for someone once in a while, this world wouldn't need so many heroes, only people who truly look." And when she finished, she closed the notebook, went out into the yard, and sat under the tree, as she always did when she needed to start over. Over time, Mariana was invited to participate in international forums on human rights and social justice. She was offered awards, television interviews, even publishing contracts with major labels. She accepted some, rejected many. She always said the same thing: "My story isn't a showcase, it's a seed, and not all seeds germinate in showcases." She preferred rural schools to luxurious auditoriums. She chose workshops with teenage girls over television studios, because there, in the mud and in the shared word, was where she felt Julián would smile if he could see her. At a conference in Medellin, someone in the audience asked her what she remembered most about him. Mariana replied that he never wanted to shine, and that's why he shines everywhere. Dora died a year later, in her bed, surrounded by the girls who had been her beloved daughters. Mariana held her hand until the end. The entire shelter remained silent for 3 days. The music was turned off, visits were suspended. Then, they organized a simple ceremony. There was no lavish coffin or long speeches. Just a photo of Dora and Julián, both smiling with a shovel in hand. They planted a tree beside it, a jacaranda. On the plaque, Mariana wrote, "Here flourishes the one who taught us to stay." Since then, the shelter courtyard has 2 large trees, their tops touching when there's a wind. The girls say they seem to speak to each other, and perhaps they do, because there are affections that transcend time, walls, and names, and because places built with love never remain empty, even if those who inhabit them change. Mariana then decided it was time to train others like her, not so they would imitate her, but so they could find their own way of stopping for others. She created a support network among the various shelters that emerged from Kilómetro Cero. In each one, she left a handwritten, different personal letter addressed to the woman who coordinated it. In those letters, she spoke of doubts, fears, mistakes. She didn't give instructions, she offered companionship. "This isn't a formula," she wrote. "It's a way of seeing. If you manage to see each one as unique, you're already doing the most difficult thing." The recipients often cried when they read them, because they understood they weren't alone. That being a guide also means allowing fragility. That strength is built in community, not in isolation. Among the many stories that began to blossom, there was one that particularly touched Mariana. A young woman in Chiapas named Nayeli, who had arrived at a shelter in absolute silence, became a storyteller. For children, she used rag dolls, puppets made from old socks, and her soft voice. She told stories of crying dragons and talking trees. When asked how she learned to tell stories like that, she replied, "I once heard a woman who told stories without shouting or fear. I wanted to do the same." Mariana met her later at a national shelter meeting. They hugged as if they had already met, and as they said goodbye, Nayeli whispered, "Thank you for staying when no one else would." Mariana didn't know what to say. She just smiled, because she understood that sometimes the most powerful things aren't said, they are sown. One morning, Mariana returned to the exact kilometer where she had first met Julián. The same rusty sign, the same curve in the road. This time there was no one at the edge of the asphalt, only the wind rustling the dry brush. She sat on a rock and took a new notebook out of her backpack. On the first page, she wrote, "Here, my life began again." Then she closed her eyes and allowed herself to feel the weight of everything she had experienced. The past didn't hurt like before, but it wasn't gone either. It was a part of her. In that silence, she remembered Julián's voice, his unadorned way of saying things, his way of being silent. When she got up to leave, she left a wildflower next to the sign, not as a tribute, but as a sign, in case anyone else passed by with a broken heart and needed a clue. That same day, upon returning to the shelter, she found a young woman sitting on the entrance bench. She had a small backpack, tired eyes, and a scar on her left eyebrow. She didn't say anything when she saw her. She just looked at her. Mariana sat next to her and offered her water. Then, without asking, she escorted her inside. She showed her the patio, the kitchen, the tree, the jacaranda. Finally, she said, "You can stay here as long as you need." The girl nodded, and for the first time in hours, she took a deep breath. Mariana, watching her walk toward the room, felt that old lump in her throat, the same one she had the day Julián made her get into the truck, and she understood, without words, that everything was starting over, that this was the true story. Not one that ends, but one that always knows how to return to the beginning. As time passed, Mariana began recording the names of everyone who passed through the shelter. Not in a database or on an official form, but in a thick-bound notebook she titled, "Those Who Decided to Stay." In it, she didn't write dates or surnames, just their first name and a phrase that summarized what each person had left behind. Luz turned on the music in the courtyard. Tomás taught us to look without fear. Clara returned with open arms. Julián chose to stop. Every time someone left, Mariana offered them the chance to write their own phrase. Not everyone did, but those who did so with silent reverence. It was an intimate, almost sacred gesture. That notebook became one of her most precious treasures, not for what it said, but for what it represented. Living proof that going through pain can leave firm roots. One afternoon, while looking through old papers in the shelter's library, Mariana found a drawing by Clara's son, Emiliano. It showed a house with a huge tree next to it and, below it, a smiling figure wearing a cap. Written below in crooked letters, it read, "My house is because he fixed it." Mariana framed it and hung it in the workshop. Every time she saw it, she felt that Julián's legacy continued to grow in unexpected ways. not just in the books or in the shelters. It also existed in the children's drawings, in the stories told in the kitchens, in the songs the girls improvised while cleaning the yard. Julián, without knowing it, had become part of the invisible fabric that held everything together, like those seams that you can't see but hold the entire garment together. Years later, during a radio interview, Mariana was asked what she would change about the past, if she could. She paused for a long time before answering. "Nothing," she said, "because even the hardest things brought me to this place. And because if Julián hadn't gone through that curve, I wouldn't be here talking to you." The journalist remained silent for a few seconds, visibly moved. Then she added, "I'm not special. I was just a girl someone decided not to abandon." That phrase resonated on the program and was echoed in thousands of messages, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was profoundly human. In a world where everything is urgent, where no one seems to have time for others, Julián and Mariana's story became a constant reminder of the essential thing: to stop. On Kilometer Zero's 10th anniversary, they organized an open house. Former residents, volunteers, and friends from other cities came. Each brought a symbolic object: a key, a notebook, a flower, a stone. Mariana placed everything on a central table in the courtyard, under the trees. There were no formal speeches, just rounds of words, hugs, and shared silences. At dusk, someone suggested singing something. One of the girls began with a soft, invented melody, and little by little others joined in. It wasn't a familiar song. It was more of a collective whisper, a way of saying thank you without saying it. Mariana, sitting at the foot of Julián's tree, looked up at the sky, turning orange. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel the need to write anything. Because in that moment, everything had been said. After the day, while they were clearing away chairs and folding tablecloths, Mariana found a folded letter among the symbolic objects. It didn't have a name. It simply read, "To those who chose to stay." She opened it carefully. The handwriting was shaky, as if it had been written with nervousness or emotion. It read, "When I arrived here, I thought no one could truly see me, but you did. You looked at me without judgment. You offered me soup without question, and that was enough to make me want to stay in this world." Mariana put the letter in her thick-covered notebook. She didn't know who had written it, but it didn't matter, because that was the essence of everything they had built: a home for those who needed to be seen without conditions. The next day, Mariana walked alone through the town. She greeted the baker, the woman from the store, the bus driver who always passed by at the same time. They all knew her, not by fame, but by habit, by affection. When she passed the old gas station where Julián used to fill up, she stopped. The place had been closed for years, but it still had the rusty sign with old prices. Mariana rested her hand on the wall and smiled. She could imagine him there, sipping his coffee from a thermos, checking the tires, whistling softly. That image gave her peace. Because she understood that some presences don't go away completely. They linger in places, in gestures, in the way of walking. And Julián somehow continued driving beside her, every time a new girl walked through the door, with fear and hope. Shortly after, Mariana received an unexpected invitation. A university in the north of the country wanted to award her an honorary doctorate for her social and literary work. She hesitated to accept, not out of false humility, but because she didn't feel comfortable in academic settings. Finally, she agreed, but under one condition: that the ceremony be held at Kilometer Zero. At first, there was resistance, but they eventually accepted. Thus, for the first time, a university ceremony was held in a dirt courtyard, under two large trees, with chickens walking between the chairs. The academics arrived dressed in suits and ties, but soon rolled up their sleeves, sat on wooden benches, and ate homemade bread. Mariana read an excerpt from her latest book. At the end, she raised her diploma and said, "This isn't mine. It belongs to all of us who once dared to stay." There was applause, but also unshed tears. That day was historic, not because of the titles, but because it consolidated something Mariana already sensed. Julián's story had sown a new way of building community, not based on merit or charity or welfare, but on active presence, on deep listening, on shared reparation. In the following months, Kilómetro Cero received more volunteers than ever, ordinary people of all ages who wanted to collaborate, learn, and offer. Mariana was careful to ensure that the shelter didn't become overcrowded. She didn't want it to grow without roots. She preferred small and sustainable to large and uncontrollable. And so, with firm steps, they expanded the space. A garden, a new library, a break room, all built with hands that had previously trembled. Because there, everything was done from the experience of having been supported first. One particularly cold winter, Mariana fell ill. It wasn't serious, but she had to rest for several weeks. For the first time in a long time, she was forced to delegate everything. At first, it was difficult. She felt she was betraying Julián's spirit if she wasn't in charge of everything. But what happened was the opposite. The girls, now strong women, took charge of the shelter with touching ease. Clara organized the shifts. Nayeli told stories to the newest members. Emiliano, now a teenager, took charge of the garden maintenance. When Mariana walked through the halls again, she found everything in order. The bread was still baking, the flowers were still growing, the voices were still ringing. And then she understood that the greatest legacy Julián had left behind wasn't immediate help, but the seed of autonomy he had sown without a word. After recovering, Mariana decided it was time to record the whole story, not as an autobiography, but as a collective testimony. She interviewed dozens of women who had passed through Kilómetro Cero. She asked them to share what they remembered from their time there, what they had felt, what they had learned. Some spoke of Julián with tenderness, others with admiration. One even said, "I didn't know him in person, but I feel like he took care of me just the same." The book was called The Man Who Didn't Ask, and there was no official presentation, no press tour. It was left on the reception desks of all the shelters, in public libraries, in schools, because Mariana knew that true stories don't need marketing. They find their way on their own, like trees that grow among stones and eventually provide shade. One morning, Mariana woke up with a clear idea: to build a small, temporary home right on the kilometer mark where Julián had found her. Not a shelter, but a short stop, a place to breathe. She secured the land with help from the municipality, built a simple cottage with recycled materials, and called it The Curve. At the entrance, a sign read, "If you're lost, if you don't know where to go, if you just want to stop for a moment, here's water, bread, and silence." There were no fixed hours or permanent staff, just a key hanging on the door, a box of notebooks, and a clean bed. Soon, notes left by passers-by began arriving. "I slept here one night, thank you. I found peace. It helped me more than I can explain." Mariana read each one as if they were new pages in Julián's diary. Over the years, many things changed, but some remained intact. Julián's tree continued to grow, now with a circular bench around it. Each anniversary, a small circle of friends would gather, where they didn't talk about achievements or statistics, but about moments. The first coffee shared, the fear overcome, the laughter that returned without warning. Emiliano, now an adult, studied social work and returned to the shelter as a coordinator. Mariana, with completely white hair, watched him from the kitchen with quiet pride. Sometimes she thought about everything they had experienced, how improbable it had all been. And she told herself that perhaps destiny isn't written with grand twists and turns, but with small decisions, like that of a man who one day stopped his truck, unaware that he was planting an entire forest. An independent documentary filmmaker learned of the story and asked permission to film at Kilometer Zero. Mariana agreed, but with clear conditions: no dramatizing suffering, no crying in front of the cameras for effect. She wanted to show everyday life, the way bread was baked, how a door was fixed, how one young woman taught another to read. The documentary was called Déteneurs, Stop, and was presented at festivals without much fanfare. However, it struck a deep note in those who saw it. She received messages from teachers, bus drivers, nurses, ordinary people who confessed to having stopped for someone, even for a moment, after seeing the film. Reading these testimonies, Mariana felt that Julián was still traveling new, invisible routes, crossing paths he himself had never imagined. One day, Mariana woke up with a persistent thought. She wanted to go back to writing letters, not emails, not social media posts. Letters with paper and ink. So she began sending envelopes to people she had met over the years. Sometimes she would simply say, "I thought about you. How are you?" Other times, she would include a photo of the tree or a copy of a fragment from her diary. Some letters came back with a reply, others didn't, but that didn't matter, because she understood that writing was also a way of being, a way of extending one's presence beyond the body, like Julián did when he fixed a lamp or left bread on the table. With each letter sent, she felt she was sowing another seed, another possibility, and so noiselessly, the web expanded again, woven by hands that had learned, thanks to him, that true love doesn't always need words. One grey sky afternoon, Mariana received a visit from a young woman with an expression very similar to the one she had had that day on the road. She didn't say much. Her name was April. Mariana let her settle in without questions, as always, but something in her sparked a different intuition. For several days, April avoided eye contact, ate alone, and slept little. Until one night, without warning, she entered the kitchen where Mariana was writing. "Did you want to leave too?" she asked. Mariana looked up and said, "Yes, but a man in a grey cap gave me water and didn't ask me any questions." From then on, everything changed. April sat silently. She didn't cry. She just breathed deeply. And for the first time, she allowed herself to stay for more than a moment. Mariana knew then that another story was beginning. That same year, Emiliano proposed a new tradition at the shelter, writing on stones. Each person who felt ready to begin a new chapter had to choose a stone from the patio and write on it a word that represented their journey. Then they placed it around Julián's tree. The words were simple yet powerful. Courage, beginning, listen, return, life. Mariana chose hers months later. Present. She placed it at the foot of the tree, next to the roots. She said it was her way of remembering that everything she had experienced was not a closed chapter, but a continuous state of being here for others. Julián was no longer in person, but he was still present in every word, in every stone, in every story that was born anew. And that, for her, was more than enough. It was a legacy that is not measured in meters or numbers, but in accompanied silences. Over the years, many of the young women who had passed through Kilómetro Cero became mothers, teachers, writers, and community leaders. Some founded their own shelters. Others returned to the shelter from time to time, just to sit under the trees or leave a new stone. Mariana always welcomed them with the same serene smile. She never said, "I told you so," or took credit for their achievements. She simply hugged, listened, and served tea and bread as she had learned from Julián. In every conversation, in every shared laugh, she felt the cycle continue to turn, not as something repeating itself, but as something that blossomed in new ways. Kilómetro Cero was no longer just a place. It was a language, a way of being in the world. One day, during a creative writing class Mariana was teaching, a girl barely 14 years old asked her how to know when to stop for someone. Mariana took a few seconds before answering. "When that person's silence weighs more than your haste," she said. The phrase was jotted down in several notebooks, and over time it appeared in graffiti, murals, and publications. It became a mantra for many. Mariana never sought to be quoted, but she understood that sometimes the most profound words aren't born from the intention to teach, but from the experience of having been there. of having felt the urgency to continue and having chosen to stay. Like Julián, like so many others after him, that awareness became her compass. If she didn't know what to do, she listened. If she didn't know what to say, she accompanied. And so, she continued writing stories that didn't seek endings, but new beginnings. In a final interview with an international media outlet, Mariana was asked if she thought Julián had been her savior. She shook her head and smiled. "He didn't save me. He showed me that it wasn't necessary to run to be worthwhile, that stopping for someone doesn't make you weak, it makes you human. We built the rest together." That answer was reproduced on thousands of sites, but Mariana didn't read any of them. On her desk, she only had a black and white photo. Julián sitting on his wooden bench, his hands dirty and his gaze calm. Next to it, a drawing of Emiliano and a stone with the word "listen." She needed nothing more. Her legacy wasn't measured in followers or press. It was there, in what flourished without her pushing it, in what she resisted without raising her voice. When she turned 70, the girls, now adults, organized a surprise celebration. They decorated the yard with lights, cooked all her favorite dishes, and gave her a new hand-bound notebook with a dedication on the first page, so that you can continue writing about what changes the world without making a sound. Mariana was moved, but she didn't cry. She took the notebook, hugged it to her chest, and said, "Then I have no excuse to stop planting." That night, under the stars, she retold the story of how it all began. She used no embellishments, no exaggeration. She spoke only of a bend in the road, a backpack on the ground, and a man who asked no questions. And as she told her story, many of those present looked at each other with a shared certainty. This story was no longer just hers. It was part of all of them. A few months later, Mariana began to walk more slowly, not because of illness, but because she felt her time should be different. She began getting up earlier, writing long letters and reading old notebooks with anecdotes from the shelter. One morning, while making coffee, she left the kettle on the stove and went to Julián's tree. She sat on the circular bench and remained silent. After a while, Abril joined her. "Do you think he knew everything that would come next?" she asked. Mariana looked at her sweetly. "No, but he didn't need to. It was enough that he knew how to stop at that moment." Abril nodded. She was no longer the withdrawn young woman she'd been before. Now she taught embroidery and poetry workshops to the new generation, and that conversation between generations sealed another invisible chain, the certainty that it was not necessary to understand the future to transform it. That same week, an 11-year-old girl arrived at the shelter accompanied by her aunt. Her name was Violeta. She had lost her parents in an accident and spoke little. Mariana watched her play in the yard with the written stones. She couldn't read very well, but she caressed the words, as if they were amulets. One afternoon, she sat down by the tree and said aloud, "There's something good here." No one answered her, but they all smiled, because they knew it was true. Violeta didn't need to understand the whole story to feel its warmth. It was enough to be there. Mariana jotted that phrase down in her new notebook, "There's something good here." And she thought that perhaps, after all, that was the best definition of what they had built. A refuge that didn't promise happy endings, but did open up space for starting over. One ordinary afternoon, Mariana fell asleep on the bench under the tree. The sun filtered light through the leaves, and the air smelled of freshly baked bread. She dreamed of Julián. They were in the truck, driving in silence. He didn't say anything, but handed her a cup of coffee. She took it and smiled. When she woke up, she felt a profound peace. She was no longer afraid of leaving. She knew everything would continue, not because she was there, but because what they had planted together was greater than any presence. She stood up slowly, stroked the tree trunk and said, "Thank you for waiting for me." Then she went into the shelter, wrote a few lines in her notebook, and made tea to share with the new residents. It was just another afternoon, but it was also a gentle, unhurried farewell. A few days later, Mariana stopped getting up early. She slept more, talked less. Emiliano cared for her tenderly, without intruding. The girls came, in one by one, to read aloud to her or simply sit by her side. No one overreacted. It was as if they all understood that life is also honored with a quiet presence. When she finally left, she did so in silence, like Julián. Her room was filled with letters, stones, notebooks. They buried her next to the jacaranda tree, next to Dora, and for the first time they wrote a double plaque. Here rest those who taught us that stopping is another way of loving. There was no thunderous sadness, only gratitude, because they knew her story wasn't over. She was alive in every word that was written, in every shared gesture, in every decision to stay when it was easier to move on. Over time, a new generation took over the reins of Kilómetro Cero. Abril, Emiliano, Violeta, a teenager, and many others who had grown up in the warmth of those trees. They didn't change the essence of the place. They kept the stones, the notebook of names, the bench, the traditions, but they also added their own: radio workshops, ecological days, community gardens. Every year on the shelter's anniversary, a different excerpt from Mariana's notebooks was read aloud. It was a way of remembering that she hadn't sought to found anything, only to respond with presence to a human need. Her legacy wasn't a monument, it was a living web, woven with time, care, and silence. One spring morning, Violeta found an unmarked wooden box in the shelter's closet. When she opened it, she found letters Mariana had never sent. They were short messages, addressed to girls who might no longer be with us, to people who had passed by briefly, to some she didn't even remember. One read, "I don't know if you remember me, but I do remember you. I hope you're well." Violeta, moved, decided to turn those letters into an exhibition. They hung them in the courtyard, among threads and clothespins, as if drying words in the sun. Those who came read them, and many cried, because they understood that those phrases weren't seeking answers, they were simply meant to accompany. And in that gesture, everything Julián, Mariana, and Dora had taught without ever intending to teach was summed up. This channel lives on thanks to those who stay. If you've decided to stay too, subscribe. It's the most beautiful way to support. Over the years, La Curva became a national symbol, not because it had plaques or recognition, but because many people began to stop there simply to breathe. Some left flowers, others letters, others just their silence. The truck drivers knew it well. They said, "That's where it all began." On one of the walls, someone wrote in marker, "No one here demands that you be strong," and no one erased it, because it was true. That modest little house represented something the entire world seemed to have forgotten: the possibility of stopping, of looking at others in time, of not rushing when someone else falls. That year, during the annual meeting of all the shelters inspired by Kilómetro Cero, Abril read aloud the phrase Mariana had said decades earlier: "When that person's silence weighs more than your haste, then you'll know it's time to stop." There was a long round of applause, but more than that, a dense and beautiful silence, like an echo that can be understood without explanation. Then each shelter shared a short story, a reconciliation, a healing, a reunion, and all of them had the same origin: someone who decided not to move on. And so, without pomp or headlines, the world changed a little. Not because of a revolution, but because of a pause, because of a man in a grey cap who didn't ask questions, because of a broken teenager who began to write again, because of a house that gave bread and shelter, because of written stones, planted trees, and unanswered letters. This wasn't a story about redemption. It was a story about humanity, and it was recorded on many roads, in many hands, in many silences, because in the end, sometimes all it takes to change life is to stop. If this story left a mark on you, don't leave without subscribing. That's all we ask to continue spreading more stories like this.